You know, the Peaky Blinders, from tailored suits, razor-edged caps, and a family that rules Birmingham. What you probably do not know is that the real Peaky Blinders were smaller, messier, and far more ordinary, and their story begins decades before the TV show. This is the real history of the Peaky Blinders. The name appears in newspaper reports and police records from Birmingham in the late 1800s. It wasn't a glamorous crime family. It was a label used by groups of young working-class men who roamed the streets of Small Heath and neighboring districts. They gambled, they fought, they stole, and they made a living however they could. One image has followed them into legend. The peaked cap with a razor stitched into the visor used to blind an opponent. It's a striking image, but the evidence is thin. Cheap cutthroat razor blades existed, but disposable safety blades were a later invention. Contemporary reports emphasize the caps and sharp dress, but not a widespread practice of blinding rivals with blades sewn into hats. The razor story likely grew because it is sensational, and sensational stories sell newspapers. So what did make the Peaky Blinders stand out at the time? Two things: style and swagger. Many members dressed in uncommonly neat clothes for men of their station: long coats, waistcoats, flat caps. That natty appearance made them visible and memorable. Combined with a readiness for violence and a taste for intimidation, they became notorious in local headlines. Small Heath at the turn of the century was an industrial place. Factories, foundries, crowded terraces, and few opportunities for stable work. For many young men, joining a gang offered protection, income often from bookmaking and running illegal gambling, and a sense of belonging. The Peaky Blinders were one of several such groups in Birmingham and the Midlands. These groups weren't monolithic. Membership waxed and waned, alliances shifted, and sometimes different crews used the same name in different neighborhoods. Their criminal activity was a mix of petty and violent crime. Court records show arrests for assault, robbery, public disorder, and illegal betting. Police in Birmingham struggled to keep pace. Resources were limited, and urban policing was still professionalizing. Newspapers amplified fear. Headlines described street fights and armed assaults, and readers wrote letters demanding action. The public panic mattered. It forced magistrates and police to respond and shaped how the gangs were remembered. Organization within the real Peaky Blinders was messier than the TV version. There was no single family dynasty controlling the city. Instead, local historians and police reports describe a loose network of youths, sometimes led by a dominant local figure, sometimes by shifting groups of friends. At times, members would coalesce for a particular purpose: a brawl, a robbery, control of a bookmaking pitch, and then disperse. The image of a disciplined, centrally commanded syndicate is largely fiction. The social context helps explain why these gangs existed. Industrialization uprooted traditional communities and concentrated poverty in new urban districts. Work was insecure and often dangerous. Local institutions like churches, unions, and mutual aid societies offered some support. But for many young men, the quickest route to money and respectability, such as it was, ran through the streets. Gangs could offer easier cash than steady labor and a reputation that turned fear into leverage. We should also remember that media sensationalism shaped the public picture. Local papers competed for readers with lurid accounts of ruffians and brutal youths. Reporters and readers alike loved a vivid villain. That appetite for spectacle encouraged simplified stories of organized criminal empires and razor-capped assassins. Real life, as it often does, was less tidy. There are a few documented individuals linked to the Peaky label, but none of them resemble the mythic Shelbys. Newspapers and court files name men charged with assault or theft, sometimes describing their clothes and neighborhoods. These records make it clear that the label Peaky Blinders could be attached to a handful of violent incidents, and to groups who used intimidation to control gambling pitches and local protection rackets. But the famous family drama and the sprawling criminal empire in the TV series are literary creations, brilliant storytelling, not documentary. The temporal rhythm is important. The Peaky Blinders' heyday in reports sits mainly in the late 19th century and into the early 20th. That predates World War I, which the show uses as a defining trauma for its characters. Many real gang members were too young to have served in 1914, or their criminal careers peaked before the war. The show's choice to center the aftermath of the Great War reshapes the timeline to serve narrative themes of trauma, politics, and social upheaval. That is not to say the show borrows nothing from reality. It captures atmospheric truths: the claustrophobic streets, the class tensions, the interplay between violence and identity. It also borrows local color and a handful of historical figures: labor agitators, corrupt officials, and small-time criminals to ground its fiction. But the line between inspiration and historical fact must be clear. The Peaky Blinders on screen are a myth based on fragments of a complicated real past. One surprising truth is how the Peaky name persisted. Different crews in different neighborhoods sometimes adopted the label, perhaps because it was useful. A terrifying nickname aids intimidation. That semantic spread means historians must be cautious. A single Peaky Blinder headline does not prove a centralized gang existed. It proves a reputation had currency. Policing reforms and social change gradually reduced gang activity. As 20th century policing became more organized and social conditions changed with fluctuating employment, increased schooling and new forms of recreation, the street gangs that once dominated working-class nightlife declined or transformed into other social formations. Some members went to prison, some emigrated, some settled down. The era of the razor-tipped cap faded into the city's memory. There are also deeper lessons in this story. Gangs like the Peaky Blinders expose how urban poverty, limited opportunity, and social marginalization create environments where violence seems like an economic strategy and a route to status. When institutions fail to provide livelihoods or social standing, alternative structures emerge. The Peaky Blinders were a symptom as much as a cause. Now, let's quickly debunk a few persistent myths. First, the razor cap legend is unproven and probably exaggerated. Second, the idea of a single Shelby family ruling Birmingham is fiction. Third, the timeline the show uses placing the gang's power in the 1920s with World War I veterans at its core is a creative choice, not a direct retelling of documented gang history. So why does the myth persist, and why does a television show inspired by that myth matter? Because stories reshape memory. Stephen Knight drew on family law, city legend and the visual power of that era to craft a narrative that resonates globally. The TV series recasts violent street gangs as stylish anti-heroes, and in doing so, turns messy social history into a clean, dramatic saga. That choice revived interest in Birmingham's past, but it also reshaped what audiences remember. If you walk the streets of Small Heath today, you will find traces of history, old terraces, factory shells, and the occasional plaque. You might also find a city trying to tell its own story beyond the myth. Museums and local historians collect the scraps, court records, police ledgers, letters to newspaper editors, photographs. From those fragments emerges a different Peaky story, less glamorous, more human, and rooted in the economic realities of the time. In the end, the real Peaky Blinders do not lose their power when stripped of their cinematic trappings. Their story remains compelling because it tells us about class, identity, and the spectacle of crime in a rapidly changing society. The myth and the history each teach us something. The myth about how culture reshapes the past. The history about why societies produce the kinds of people who become legends. The Peaky Blinders of record were not masterminds of a criminal empire. They were young men in a harsh industrial city, making choices in a world that offered few good options. Their legend grew through newspapers, rumor, and later television. Knowing the real story does not make the drama any smaller. It deepens the stakes and the humanity behind the myth. This is History Uncovered.